Morning, everybody. My name is Nancy McBrady. I am the Deputy Commissioner of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. I want to welcome you to this session where we're going to be reviewing the state of PFAS response here in the state, our program in particular, and also providing information about the PFAS fund and also taking public comment at the end on the fund and general overarching comments on PFAS response, generally speaking. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of Commissioner Amanda Beal. She apologizes for not being able to be here today with all the storm damage of the past few weeks. We've got a lot going on at the department, and so she's working to work on some of the damage response. I'm going to look at my phone here for the agenda, which I'll walk us through. But first, let me introduce you to the advisory committee for the PFAS fund. These folks here up at the front who will be listening carefully and participating today have been a critical component of the creation of the PFAS fund. And we'll learn more about what exactly they have done and what the PFAS fund will be doing later today. So I'll ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Jim at the end there. Thank you. And we have, I think, 4 others who are unable to be here today. But this advisory group met over the course of 2022 and helped put together and approve the PFAS plan, which, again, we'll be talking further about today. Let me also take the opportunity. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I'm going to ask people to raise their hand as I introduce them from our PFAS team here. I'll start with Director Beth Valentine. She is the director of the PFAS fund. And I am completely going to blank on your last name, Hamlin. Melissa Hamlin is our newest member as of about a month or 2 ago. She has joined the PFAS fund with particular focus on land acquisition, as well as other components of the fund. Felicia Witten is a member of our team. She is a PFAS response professional within our group. She works directly with impacted farms. Megan Hennessy is our director of the PFAS response program. You guys have name tags. This is so helpful. I should know. Yeah. Anyway, Duncan Failer, also our agricultural PFAS specialist who works with farms directly. Mary Yerlina, another member of the team. And in the back, we have some folks. Hi, Amy. How are you? Amy and Michelle, who help with the administration of the program. There are forms and tracking and lots of administration that needs to happen, and it would not work well without their assistance. And with that, I think what I will next do is explain how the next hour or so is going to go. Megan Hennessy will provide a brief overview on the history of PFAS and how we have created a response program here within the state. And then Felicia and Duncan are going to walk through some examples of how they have worked with some specific farms to provide information about how we've been able to make some progress on the ground. And Mary, I'm sorry, you're part of it too. After that, those case studies are explained. We will then transition over to Director Valentine to talk about the fund. And as part of that, Dean Diane Rowland will then be talking about research in particular and soliciting new ideas about areas of research that the PFAS fund can support. And then last but not least, the public comment period where we'll be getting your feedback and soliciting your input. I also want to make a shout out to Rick Kurzbergen in the back. He needs no introduction other than to say he has been a member of our team as a consultant and working with dairy farmers, and he has been a wonderful addition to our team. All right, who am I handing off to? Megan, thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Just getting settled here. So, like Nancy's, I do not, it sounds like I'm not. Excellent. I can see the notes too, so it's even better. Well, good morning, everyone. And I think most of you are fairly familiar with the timeline and what has brought us to today, but just wanted to make sure we go into this with that understanding. And it's not, there it is. So in 2016, there was a farm in Arundel that had some monitoring wells on their land for the local water district. The local water district, following some federal guidance, did some routine testing and determined that there were PFAS in that supply, which got everyone wondering what that meant for the farm. If it's in the water, it's likely in the soil, and the animals would be eating it. And what does that mean for dairy? It was, of course, in the dairy, and that led to the creation of our first action level. So the point above which we would consider a product adulterated and no longer able to be sold commercially. We also kept looking and realizing this was more than just one farm, more than likely. And in 2019, Governor Mills created a task force to review the problem and make some recommendations on safe drinking water and food, and identifying and investigating PFAS in the environment here in Maine. Around the same time those results were coming out in 2020, we did some retail milk testing, and tracing that back through the system, identified a second dairy that had high levels of PFOS, a particular compound in their dairy, and a third dairy was discovered thereafter. So at this point, we were, I think, recognizing this was not an isolated situation. In 2021, we were very fortunate that the legislature approved a budget for a multi-agency response. That included a specific law directing our Maine DEP, Department of Environmental Protection colleagues, to investigate PFAS substance contamination of both land and groundwater. So that really has been driving a lot of the work that our department has been doing thus far. Some others will speak a little more about that later. In 2022, the PFAS response program team members that Nancy just introduced, as well as a GIS technology coordinator, were hired, as well as Director Valentine for the fund. And in 2022, it was a busy year. The ban on the land application of sludge also went into effect. So that is trying to turn off the tap, so to speak, on land contamination in Maine. Last year, 2023, the fund plan was finalized. I'm sure you'll hear more about that process. And 2024, this year, half of all license application sites must be completed by DEP, with 2025 deadline of all sites investigated by DEP. There are over 7,000 farms in Maine, and we still believe the vast majority are likely not impacted, but the locations that are impacted, it can be an extreme impact. We also don't believe that it's a Maine issue. There's all sorts of sources of PFAS contamination, military sites, landfills, leachate, etc., as well as this land application spreading of biosolids being a practice that has happened across the country. So Maine has been a leader, but we do not expect to be the only state that has to grapple with this. So we wanted to highlight that this really has been a multi-agency effort. State government can rightfully be accused of working in silos and not necessarily talking to each other. This has been an issue where I truly believe that's not been the case. It's broken down barriers. So Maine DACF, we work directly with the commercial farms. We sample products, soils, irrigation water, and we regulate acceptable concentrations in farm products. Our DEP colleagues, like I said, are tasked with testing historically licensed sludge and septic sites, as well as your home well, if you're residential drinking water, landfill leachate, etc. Our colleagues at Maine CDC have been incredibly vital to helping us navigate all of this and making sure that we're protecting public health, looking at toxicity values, consumption rates. There's a science behind the action levels and the screening levels that they have been driving. They also work with us on a weekly basis on site-specific factors at different farms. And they also have been advising individuals who may have concerns for their own personal public health. That's an area the Maine CDC takes the lead on. Also at the Department of Health and Human Services is the Maine Drinking Water Program. They are responsible for overseeing public water systems. And Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has been out testing wildlife, and they will issue do not eat advisories where appropriate for that. So sometimes when folks might hear the state is out and they've been harvesting animals, if it's deer or turkey, that would be the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Group. In addition to all of that, it's broken down barriers getting outside of the state and working with our partners like Maine Extension and the Research Station and Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, Maine Farmland Trust have certainly been vital partners to this. Defend Our Health has also been really helpful coordinating with folks. So wanted to highlight that. And also want to highlight just the existing financial assistance. Like I said, we're very fortunate the legislature gave us funding to help to try to do our best to help support farms through this process. It's not always viable in every instance, but thankfully most of our farms have been able to receive support and continue on operating, perhaps modified, but continuing to operate. So we have testing reimbursement for folks who may have done some self-testing. Water can be filtered very effectively. We also have an existing viability or infrastructure support program. We can replace currently up to 12 months of lost income replacement. And in the instances where unfortunately it might not be economically viable to depurate an animal, so allow them to remove the PFAS from their systems over time. If you can stop PFAS coming in, they'll excrete them over time, but that's not always economically viable or possible. And we do have an indemnification program that we can support farmers for some of those losses. So just to highlight the existing programs, we have spent over $880,000 through the viability infrastructure that has often been providing clean feed. So trying to eliminate that intake of contamination. New equipment. So say a farm could safely grow corn or other grains. We've supported them in the infrastructure necessary to do that. Perhaps greenhouses, we'll talk more about. Water delivery to again eliminate the exposure pathway of the vegetables in that case, or fencing to keep animals off of more contaminated land. Water filtration is a little more straightforward, but for installation and current O&M, the department has spent over $96,000, and we also will continue supporting those ongoing operation and maintenance costs. And to date, we have approved a little over $1.4 million in income replacement. Again, that's currently for a 12-month window. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Felicia.
Thank you, Ms. Megan. I appreciate that. So I was going to start off by introducing our team, but that has been covered. So we will move right along. So DACF's farm-specific response. We are here to support farms by identifying PFAS contamination, pursuing strategies to reduce and eliminate PFAS, and providing technical and financial assistance to retain farm viability. So data is key. DACF conducts and pays for comprehensive and ongoing sampling of milk, feed, soil, meats, and livestock, among other things. And it's important to note that every farm is different. We work with producers to interpret and make management recommendations that lead to a drop in PFAS level in milk and meat. And it's also important to note that not all PFAS are the same. We tend to focus on PFOS, but I'd like to note here that PFOA it appears different. It doesn't appear to transfer to beef, and there's little uptake in asparagus, garlic, potatoes, grains, corns, and other products. So where are we in Maine? As of now, DEP has completed their tier 1 and tier 2 sampling and has begun their tier 3 sampling. When a farm is involved, DACF is notified. From there, so far, DACF has contacted 80 farms, including self-testers. Approximately 60 of these farms have at least one test exceeding the main screening level. So the impact on operations varies depending on the type of product being produced on the farm. Just a little overview of how DACF conducts their investigations. The first thing that we do is gather information. We try to get all of the inputs, products, operations, animal management, every detail of the farm that we can. From there, we create and execute a sampling plan. Probably the hardest part of the sampling plan is time. There are a few labs that test for PFAS in the area. Often there are long wait times to get results back. That is improving with the opening of more labs. Once we have received the results, they're interpreted. All of our results are validated by DEP, and we also discuss them interagency amongst ourselves. Once that is complete, we go into mitigation recommendations. This might include follow-up sampling. We often work directly with CDC for their input. Some other things that we also offer is financial assistance throughout this whole process. And we also offer mental health and other support resources via partner organizations. So at this time, Duncan is going to come up and he's going to talk about one of our studies.
Good morning, guys. So I'm going to give you guys an overview of a particular farm that we worked with that was impacted, and kind of walk you through how we investigated this farm, and also break down and provide a little more transparency for what the state does in terms of sampling and what sort of questions come up when we're doing this work. So going to do this chronologically, and we've actually broken this down. Our program now has farm phases. So each farm is designated into a phase, which is basically like, where are they in the investigation process? The first phase is the new farm phase. For this particular farm, we were notified by DEP through their tiered testing program that agricultural activity was occurring on the farm. And then they also shared the results from the soil testing that they had conducted, as well as a map of the area, so telling us where they sampled those results, and contact information for the property owner. That was a great start for us. Gives us an idea of what we need to be considering moving forward. We also use the current action levels for milk and beef, as well as our dairy-specific soil screening level, to essentially as a guideline. If we see, for instance, a soil level that is above one of our screening levels, that keys us in that we need to look into this further. It's not necessarily something that being above the screening level in certain instances can not be a problem, but it is always an instance where we need to look further. So For this particular farm, we did see soil levels above the screening level. And so that clued us in that we needed to do additional sampling and follow up with the farm. So that moved us into phase 1, which is our data collection phase. As Felicia mentioned earlier, data is vital to our investigations. We need to have good data. We need to have actionable data. So we want to collect results that we can act upon. The tests that we do or that the labs conduct for PFAS are very expensive. We want to make sure that we're spending that money with the best return possible. So we'll contact the owner, inform them of what we're doing, and we'll collect basic information about the farm. You know, what are you growing? What are your markets? How many animals do you have? Do you source feed from other farms? What's the acreage like? What's, you know, how many acres in pasture? How many acres in hayland? Do you do any other, do you grow any other crops? So it's a pretty in-depth questionnaire or interview process, I would say. And it generally concludes with us scheduling a site visit because as PFAS specialists and with the understanding that all of these farms operate on slightly different, with it slightly differently, getting us at the farm in person and actually walking around the farm and talking with the producer is really gives us so much more information than just doing it over the phone. For this farm in particular, we visited the farm and we were able to develop a sampling plan that included testing of the feed as well as testing of some frozen beef product that the farmer had available from last year. We found that this was a small beef operation. They were growing about 10 feeder animals that they were then selling to selling to the freezer trade in the spring. So after they had fed these animals their winter hay and fattened them on some cornmeal or grain concentrates. So knowing that we needed to test that we wanted to test the feed to see if that was an exposure pathway, and we wanted to test the beef to see if it was found in detectable amounts. We got our analysis from the lab back for the beef product. So this is what some of those lab reports look like for producers. For producers, the first time seeing this can be very overwhelming and honestly can look like gibberish. So part of our responsibility is to translate this into a more distilled version, something they can easily understand. And that's what I've highlighted here. We have an action level for PFAS in beef. And you can see very clearly, I highlighted that level here. And then the concentration there is 2.68, which is below our current action level, but was still high enough for us to want to work more with the farm to try to reduce or eliminate that exposure pathway, as is our mission for the program. The farmer was cooperative in doing that. And we recognized that in the feed samples from the farm, so the feed that they grew on the farm, we saw detectable levels in the feed. We recommended that they stop providing that feed to the animals that they were bringing to market that year. We also sampled some feed that they had bought from another farm. That feed was non-detect. So that told us that that would not be an exposure source. We were able to feed that to the animals that would be slaughtered in the spring. And because this was a new farm that we were working with and we were relatively early in the investigation, we wanted to see if the research on depuration was correct. And so we were going to use this opportunity to look at how the levels in these animals might drop once that exposure is ceased. So as part of that, we developed a sampling plan that included collecting live animal tissue as well as blood from these animals over a 3-month time period. We collected tissue from 5 animals, and this was done by taking a piece of the muscle tissue from the animal's abdomen or rib area. This was a procedure that we coordinated a veterinarian to do. It is an invasive procedure, but given the labs needing a certain volume of sample in order to properly analyze it, we weren't able to use a needle aspirate or like a biopsy punch. And we're still working with those labs to try to get less and less material in order to sample. But for this, we took about 4 or 5 grams of muscle tissue, sewed the animals back up, and we're then planning to test the muscle tissue at slaughter later on to see if we could see a decrease in those levels. We then came back 2 other times. We collected blood at the same time that we collected muscle tissue, and then 2 other times throughout that 3-month period to see if we could also see a change in the blood concentration and possibly correlate that blood concentration to what we see in the muscles. Because if we could collect blood, that would be a lot less invasive and a lot easier for us to do than collecting the muscle tissue itself. We tried to do this with fecal material as well, but we didn't see any detectable amounts. So it was determined that that would not be a viable way to determine the levels in the animals. So these are the results from that study. So you can see, and I'm going to take the mic here so that everybody can hear me. Just to explain these graphs a bit. So we see the muscle concentration here. We only have 2 time points for the muscle concentration, but you can see the starting time point around March 7th was when we collected this tissue, was between 2.5 and 1.25 parts per billion for PFAS in the 5 animals. And you can see over time that the majority of these animals, 4 of the 5, depurated quite well, down to levels that we either could not detect or levels that were less than 1. We do see, and this is something that we're still working on and trying to determine, that one of the animals did not change that much. For some reason, we see that in certain animals, that they don't seem to depurate even or as quickly as others. But that's one of the questions that we're trying to still answer. So these are the muscle concentrations for those 5 animals. We also have the serum concentrations so that would be the blood that we collected from the animals. You see a starting range in between 20 and 30 parts per billion in the blood, which is about 10 times the concentration that we see in the muscle. Again, we see a pretty steady depuration here with most of the animals, but we do see a slight increase for one of them. Once again, in research and with a small sample size like this, those kind of things happen. And that's another question, something that we're still working to better understand why some of these animals have varying levels. Identifying exposure can be very, very difficult. We filtered the water at this farm. We were providing feed that was non-detect. And we were trying to keep those animals on soil that was non-detect or less than 1 part per billion. So we did look at that information, and we used this as well as some information later on from several other farms to be able to correlate that if we have blood concentration levels above 30 parts per trillion, we should not release that animal for sale. That frees up having to do invasive surgery on the animals and also allows the producer to hold the animal longer to get them to depurate so that when they do slaughter, they can sell that animal. Otherwise, we would have to test at slaughter, and then it's a toss-up as to whether we would be able to permit that animal to be sold or not, because we're not sure what the concentration would be. We don't want to be surprised. So this testing the blood serum was the most effective approach for us and continues to be at this time. Follow-up sampling, that part of the project was done when there was still snow on the ground, so we weren't able to collect soils from the pastures, but we did do follow-up sampling of the pasture areas. So these are the areas where the animals would be during the spring and summer and into fall. And we saw that for the pastures, we had relatively low levels less than 1 part per billion in the soil to non-detect. So what that tells us is that pastures are not going to be a significant source of exposure for these animals. That was really key for us determining a really helpful strategy for this farm to still be able to use their winter feed and sell their animals just at a different time. So they're actually able to use the natural rotation of these animals. If they moved their slaughter date from the spring to the fall, they could use that period when they're on these pastures to depurate. They're still going to receive a little bit of exposure, but it shouldn't be enough that would put them over any current action level. So that was great for us because we could tell this producer, hey, you can still use these pastures or you can still use these hay fields even though they're impacted, even though we see that they're contributing. You can use them for a certain period of time, because if you slaughter in the fall or sell your animals in the fall, you're going to give yourself several months, which we've proven is enough time to adequately depurate these animals and not be a concern to the general public as far as a food product goes. So we followed this up in 2023, and we collected serum samples from the animals while they were on pasture and then up to the time when they were going to be sold at auction. So you see a time period in late June here. This is a different group of animals, but they would have received similar exposure because they were fed that winter hay that was contaminated. You can see the levels here are pretty low. So this is in parts per billion. We see levels from 10 to 15 on average in the animals in the fall or in June. And then by September, we see those levels dropping into the single digits, which, as I said earlier, is much lower than the kind of threshold we have around 30 parts per billion. So these animals were checked off to go to sale, and that producer was able to make money from those animals despite having impacted hay fields. So that's the end of that. We're still working with this producer. They've been very cooperative, and it's a good example of how the research or the studies that we're doing can contribute to the knowledge for all of the farmers in Maine, and that there can be successes with farms that are still impacted. And I think we're going to hold questions till the very end, so hold on. Sorry, yes, that is a misprint. Yes, sorry, that should say 23. Sorry, that should say 23. I apologize. Yes, we're not in the future yet. I'm going to move it over to Mary Urlina, who's going to talk about a vegetable farm case study.
My glasses. What's our time situation? Talk fast. All right. Okay. So my example is a vegetable farm, and just as in the case of a livestock operation, we have our phase 1 basic information gathering, data gathering. In this particular instance, this was a self-tester. The farm decided to get their wells tested on their own, and anyone can find out information about testing on the DEP website. That's what these 2 images show. My guess is that this farm would have eventually been tested by DEP, but they wanted to get a jump on it. The farm itself was not a spread site, but they were adjacent to a spread site, so they were concerned. And they tested themselves, and they also hired a contractor to do some sampling for them. And they shared that information with DACF and asked for our assistance. All right, so again, we're still in phase 1. We're gathering information, we're sampling, and we're planning. So this is one snapshot of a well water test. And you can see there's a lot of PFAS compounds in the well. Whoops, I can't, there we go. Some of us, maybe you're familiar with the sum of 6, and the DEP has that an action level for domestic wells set at 20 parts per trillion. This particular case had over 8,000 parts per trillion. PFAS compounds, not so much the PFOS that were, but other compounds. And given the time constraints, I'm not going to try and pronounce PFHPA and those other PFAS compounds, but they were in there. Might be degradation chemicals from the PFAS, the PFOS, and the PFOA. And there is also PFOA in this well water sample as well. So definitely, we're concerned. This data basically demonstrates that water is an exposure pathway for the products on this farm. Is it the only exposure pathway? So we do like to test soil. Michelle can tell you that the DACF team has sampled probably over 800, I believe, soil samples in the past 2 years on farms around the state. We're usually a solo act. Duncan and I and Felicia will go out on our own, but this was a special case not related to the farm example. We were actually looking at examining better ways to characterize the PFAS in fields. So we teamed up with DEP and we did a study this past year. But the gear is all the same. We have a metal bowl, we've got a stainless steel soil core, we have GPS devices and data collection apps on our mobile devices for collecting soil data. So we did test the soil on this particular farm, and it turns out it was not a significant pathway for exposure for farm products, and which makes sense because it wasn't a spread site. So next question. So if we have impacted water, how is this impacting the vegetable products on this farm? So that involves taking plant samples, perhaps a little less exciting than taking blood and tissue from beef animals, but we do have to do it carefully. Often some vegetables are in the ground, so you don't want soil to be remaining on the samples. You do need to clean them very carefully. Root materials in particular need to wash. You want to make sure that dust and rainwater is not contaminating the soil sample. Because again, you want the lab to be telling you what's in the actual plant tissue and not what may be, casually being deposited on it from the environment. So what we do, we use PFAS-free water to wash all of this stuff. We label it, we freeze it, and we ship it overnight to a lab, usually Battelle in Massachusetts. So in phase 2, we get some data, and we're going to respond to that data. So indeed, there was PFAS contamination from the water to the vegetables on this farm. These are, do I have to take this apart? I'm not going to. So microgreens is one of the products that this particular farm specializes in. And indeed, they had hits on a number of the PFAS compounds, the same ones that were found in the well water, plus a weird one. There's thousands of PFAS chemicals. They do degrade. There's precursors as well. And we're just scratching the surface of our understanding of all of these PFAS compounds. So we need to mitigate this. There are no action levels in Maine for PFAS compounds on vegetables. However, we do work very, very closely with CDC, and they are looking at data sets that the federal government has on toxicity levels. So they are able to help us decide when something is of concern. And indeed, that we decided that this is of concern. And of course, the farmers are concerned about it too. They've got markets and customers that expect a certain type of quality product from farms. So we do take that into consideration. All right, so the easiest way to address a contaminated water supply is to put a carbon filter on that. That's pretty standard operation. DEP does that, DACF does that. We do monitor these filtration systems pretty carefully 4 times a year to make sure there's no breakthrough. Sorry, I can't read the screen, so I have to use paper notes. It's analog. Yeah, and when breakthrough is detected, we change out those carbon filters. However, when you've got a farm situation, farms use a lot of water. You need a lot of water to get vegetables growing. If you have a drought year, which we had not this past year, but the year before that, vegetable operations use a lot of water. And they also use it for post-harvest handling for cleaning vegetables. So when you slap a filter on a well, you're going to cut down dramatically the flow of water that's available for your farm activities. So a filtration system was not going to be the complete fix for this particular farm. So this very complicated slide shows you a collaboration that we had with a talented geohydrologist from DEP who had been studying PFAS contamination in groundwater in this particular community. And he mapped out or modeled some plumes that he thought were likely happening in terms of the flow of PFAS underground to help DACF and the farmer site a new irrigation well and also an irrigation pond, which would provide them with better water supply for their activities throughout the season. And final slide. So phase 3, phase 4, we're mitigating, we're monitoring. We're getting to that point where the farm products are not of current concern. And this is a lovely photo of a greenhouse that DACF helps support. And this is part of the infrastructure support for farm viability projects. So impacted farmers can submit applications explaining how a proposed project will allow them to pivot and remain viable going forward. And in the case of this farm, a reduced water supply for their operation, meant that they could not grow as many vegetables in their fields during the summer, and that had an impact on their farm income. So a high tunnel that allows you to do very precision watering and have, 3-season production of greens would allow them to be a viable farm business again. So that's my slides. Thank you. There we go.
So thank you to all of the presenters. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge advisory committee members who are joining us via Zoom, and I regret that I can't see them all, but I want to acknowledge our fantastic co-chair, Senator Stacey Brenner, Representative Jessica Fay, as well as Senator Rick Bennett, Representative Randall Hall, Commissioner Beal of DACF, Commissioner Loisem of DEP, Deputy Director of Maine DHHS, Nancy Beardsley, Sherry Hamill, Farm Service Agency State Director, Steve Crane of Crane Brothers Farm, Keisha Holmes from Misty Brook Farm, and Rebecca Bolas from Maine Public Health Association. I needed to read because I didn't want to leave anybody out. I am going to briefly stop sharing that screen and start sharing the next presentation. This works. Yay, excellent. Okay. So what is the PFAS fund? Whoops. That did not advance. Yeah. That's it. Okay. Okay. Still not advancing. Thank you. I am Beth Valentine. I'm the director of the PFAS Fund. You may wonder, what is the PFAS Fund? Well, the PFAS Fund is at its heart a program to keep farmers farming despite the presence of PFAS. We will be providing 4 categories of support. We will build upon the existing programs within the Department of Ag. The first of these categories is direct assistance to farmers. This can be technical or financial assistance. We'll be extending the work of the PFAS response program. So for instance, the current income replacement program will be shifting over to the PFAS response program. A significant difference is that until now, farmers have been eligible for up to 12 months of lost income. Moving forward, once the rules are finalized, we'll be able to provide up to 24 months of lost income. Also within this category, there's some new programs, for instance, a one-time grant to help cover the costs, some of the administrative costs that are common to all farms in the initial phases of PFAS discovery. So time spent with the agricultural PFAS specialist, time spent communicating with customers, time spent starting to plan what your next steps are. The other 3 categories are new initiatives. The PFAS Fund will be able to purchase PFAS impacted land from willing sellers at the fair market value as if there was no contamination. The PFAS Fund will also be supporting research to help us gain a better understanding of what can be done on farm despite the presence of PFAS. So sort of similar to the blood serum and meat tissue sampling to help strategize how to move forward. And finally, the PFAS Fund will be supporting health initiatives. So this will include things like blood serum testing, access to mental health services, as well as studies to help us understand exposure pathways and mitigation measures related to human health. I forgot to mention, the PFAS Fund was established by Governor Mills with bipartisan legislative support, initially funded at $60 million with state funds. Since then, we have received a USDA grant of $5 million to augment that state support. And we will continue to look for additional resources moving forward. But having the money and being able to spend it are not the same thing. The first step, the department needed to hire somebody to oversee this program. That's yours truly. The fund also needed to establish an advisory committee, the folks at this table and those joining us by Zoom. And the first task of the advisory committee was to come up with a plan for spending the money. Most of that planning work happened during the first half of 2023. The advisory committee met 6 times between January and July. Simultaneously, 4 issue-focused subcommittees met a total of 26 times within that same time period. And the result of all those meetings was the PFAS Fund implementation plan. Now I'm going to ask Adrienne Lee to come and speak about that planning process from her perspective as both an advisory committee member and as the co-chair of the Financial and Business Support Subcommittee.
Hi. Yeah, so as Beth was saying, I'm on the advisory committee and also was co-chairing the Financial and Business Support Subcommittee. And just to kind of help give an overview of how this process worked is we had our advisory committee that then took on and reviewed the allowable uses for this fund that were put forth through the statute. And then we divided into subcommittees that then tackled different components of that. And we divided into 4 different subcommittees: financial and business support, land transfer, research, and health. And I think a great aspect of these subcommittees is it allowed for both advisory committee members as well as other stakeholders, impacted farmers, specialists to join in and really help put all of our brains together to to kind of try to move forward with how best we can support farms in these different components of how the fund was supposed to operate. The Financial and Business Support Committee that I was co-chair of, our mission was to develop, analyze, and recommend strategies for the committee for both short and long-term financial planning assistance for impacted PFAS impacted farmers. And it was a really great group of folks that represent a lot of different aspects of the agricultural community, I think, that came together. We met pretty rigorously between the advisory committee and the bi-monthly meetings that we had as a subcommittee through the winter, like late winter, spring of 2023. We reviewed all of the potential kind of statute-based aspects of financial and business support that were suggested through that statute, as well as kind of tried to identify other ways that we felt farms that were impacted by PFAS contamination were going to need support in working through this process. Some of those were, some big ones were, there's the infrastructure and the income replacement programs that already DACF was working on as well. And then also identifying this need for technical assistance, having some PFAS response navigators, which were basically trying to help farmers navigate this new reality of how to manage PFAS on their farm and also help ensure that they're getting the support they need and are aware of the different programs that are out there for them. And also looking, as Beth was mentioning earlier, some of these other things like how to try to help farmers compensate for like what is now like another full-time job for one member of the farm to figure out how to navigate PFAS in their operation. And we work through each one of these different kind of these different issues by asking questions of thinking of what farms, who is going to be eligible for these different programs, who is going to benefit, and then also really trying to work through who may be disadvantaged by whatever aspect of support we were trying to put forward. And I think I'd say we're very intentional about that and looking very holistically. We had a pretty broad group of folks on these committees that represented different aspects of agriculture, had different levels of expertise that I think really helped inform these decisions. And then we worked through all these subcommittee meetings to come up with proposals that we then brought to the full advisory. And kind of how this worked was really like how within the financial business support group was kind of how all the subcommittees worked within our meetings last spring. So I'm gonna let you kind of go on to the implementation.
Thanks, Adrian. So now we are in the implementation phase. That has involved a lot of sort of internal in-house work to get contracts in place, to create the policies, to identify the coding systems. Kind of dull, but very necessary work. Melissa, will you raise your hand again? Melissa joined us the end of November. She will be responsible for the land acquisition and stewardship elements of the plan. And also she's assisting with the financial support programs. So we're getting the pieces into place that we need to start spending the money. And another big piece is rulemaking. Whenever the state is awarding grant funding, there need to be rules governing who's eligible, what are the evaluation criteria, if somebody's upset, what is the appeals process. So we currently have 9 draft rules for each of these topic areas open for public comment. I have a summary of the rules here on the table. The full text is available on DACF's website. There is a public hearing next Tuesday, January 16th at 90 Blossom Lane, across the river. People are welcome and invited to come. We ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes per rule. We're also accepting written comments. Those can be submitted to me through January 26th. And I have business cards up here. You can grab one of those with my email address. But the big question, I'm sure is on everyone's mind, is when the heck is the money going to be available? Well, the answer is soon after the rulemaking process is completed. If there are no substantive changes to the draft rules that are presently available, the rules could be finalized by the end of February, and funding would flow soon after that. If there are substantial changes, then we may need to have another period of public comment according to the Maine Administrative Procedures Act. If that is the case, that would delay the timeline by a month, maybe two. But once those rules are finalized, shortly thereafter, the PFAS fund will begin accepting applications for time spent on PFAS response. That's that one-time administrative grant I mentioned, $3,500. We'll begin accepting income replacement applications, applications for no-cost technical assistance. This is stuff like business planning, speaking to a marketing consultant, any sort of professional services necessitated by the presence of PFAS to help the farm pivot to a new type or form of production. Currently, the PFAS response team manages infrastructure project proposals valued at less than $150,000. For projects valued above that threshold, those would be managed by the PFAS fund. And also loan assistance. The PFAS fund can help if a farm needs a new loan because of PFAS. We can assist with cost, sort of the extra cost. So maybe the cost of loan insurance or a guarantee on that loan. There's going to be one master application for all of DACF's PFAS related support programs. So you as an impacted farmer don't need to figure out which program to submit the application to. There's going to be one master application. You submit it to the department. You could submit it through the agricultural PFAS specialist that you're working with. You could email it to Megan or myself. We'll figure out internally who needs to deal with it. So we want to make it simple for the user. Additionally, shortly after the rules are finalized, the PFAS fund will begin accepting inquiries for land purchases. And this will be the initial step in what will ultimately be a many months long process for land acquisition. The department will need to engage appraisers, surveyors, environmental consultants. But at least in the near term, we can start accepting applications for land purchases from interested sellers. We have begun and will continue to work on developing application materials and procedures for a competitive research grant program, and also contracting for blood testing and mental health services. And related to mental health services, there is currently a survey available on DACF's website. We're asking for input. The PFAS fund is looking to provide mental health services to support impacted farmers, their families and workers, as well as non-farm residents whose well water has been impacted by the land application of biosolids. So if you fall into any of those categories, please go online, complete the survey. It's completely anonymous, but it will help me to contract for services that are wanted by the impacted community. If you prefer not to do an online survey, we do have paper copies here. Feel free to grab one, or again, you can email me and I'll mail you a copy. Additionally, DACF is collaborating with Maine CDC. DACF will be responsible for setting up the program, paying for the blood testing and the mental health services. DACF will take on some additional related responsibilities. Likely this coming summer, they will take on their own rulemaking proceeding to make PFAS blood serum test results reportable, much like the way that pediatric lead testing results are reportable to Maine CDC. This will allow CDC to follow up with individuals who have elevated levels of PFAS in their blood serum, advise them, well, first to help try to identify what is the source of exposure, to understand if mitigation measures are being taken, and also the state toxicologist can be a resource for the impacted individual's primary care physician. CDC is developing educational resources for both clinicians and impacted individuals so that the clinicians, in the grand scheme of things, exposure to PFAS is not well known among the medical community. So Maine CDC will be developing guidance for clinicians, what to do when somebody comes into the office with these high test results. And also similar materials for members of the impacted public. What do your blood test results mean? What should you do next? CDC will be undertaking a farm and farm worker soil exposure study, looking at to what extent incidental soil exposure is a pathway of concern. So this could be inhalation, ingestion, or through the skin. They're doing some modeling now. They might pilot some field work summer of 2024. The full-blown study most likely will be summer of 2025. And then CDC is also exploring a body burden reduction trial. So we heard a little bit about how do you get PFAS out of a cow? Same question, or similar question. How do you get PFAS out of a person? The plan, the PFAS Fund implementation plan, describes a strategy whereby the department would hire a vendor to design a study, and then we could support the study. An alternative that we have been discussing recently is maybe we can tap into an existing clinical trial and entice an academic researcher to expand their existing study to include a cohort from Maine. So those are two avenues under investigation at the moment. Other short to midterm goals is PFAS response kit and PFAS response navigators. Those two goals are closely tied. Adrian mentioned both of them. The PFAS response kit will be a physical binder with information that an impacted farmer will have at their fingertips. So what resources are available from DACF, DEP, Maine CDC, the nonprofit organizations, the universities. And similarly, the PFAS response navigators is going to be a person similar to a caseworker, maybe in a medical setting, to you have your diagnosis, what are your next steps? Who do you need to speak to? Our vision is that the PFAS response navigators are going to know this PFAS response kit inside and out, and will be there to make the phone calls and to sort of ease the pathway forward. Additionally, in the short term, we are developing research and land advisory panels to help with the selection of research projects and land acquisition. Sort of a more midterm goal is land stewardship. Once the department purchases this contaminated land, what are we going to do with it? Will it, potentially be resold, but with an agricultural easement on it, restricting its use so that only safe products can be produced? Would we retain it and lease it also for an agricultural purpose? Would we manage it for conservation purposes or carbon goals, greenhouse gas sequestration? Thank you, goals. So that's and the use of any property that the department acquires is going to be case specific. And finally, the department will be developing guidance on land transactions for parties outside of the state who are still involved, outside of state agencies who are still involved in land transactions, so realtors and appraisers, et cetera. More in the longer term, we're exploring conservation payments, much like the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, where farmers are paid, a modest rental fee for implementing conservation practices. In that case, the focus is really on water quality. Well, can a program like that be expanded to include management measures intended to minimize the impacts of PFAS? One of the parcels purchased by the state may become an experiment station to, again, help broaden our understanding of what can be done on impacted agricultural land. Once we start getting the results of this research that the PFAS Fund will be supporting, we will compile and share those results. Medical monitoring, we expect that as a result of the increased blood serum testing, there will be folks who are identified with elevated levels according to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Math. People whose PFAS blood serum levels are above those of the general public ought to have enhanced medical monitoring. Is there a way that the PFAS fund can cover some of those costs, the costs that aren't covered by insurance? And as I mentioned before, the clinical trial, at this stage, we're exploring avenues for conducting that trial. The longer term is to actually conduct the trial. And I think, so I am shortly going to turn the microphone over to Diane to speak about the research component of the PFAS fund. I want to tee up a question now for when we get into the more interactive part of the meeting. How can the PFAS fund best serve you? What is the best way for us to share information? What are your most pressing needs? So keep those and other questions at the back of your mind. And I would like to reintroduce Dean Diane Rowland.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go through what we did on the research subcommittee. I led that with Commissioner Amanda Beal. And sort of a similar process. We met frequently, went through what a research portion of the fund would look like. And here you can see the description of what the fund was in the original goal. And so part of this was to essentially come up with a process whereby research funding might be determined. And so that would involve requests for research. So what we typically call a request for applications. And then those applications would then need to be reviewed. And that's typically done with a review panel. And so you can see some of the agencies that would be involved in that process. And that's part of the rulemaking that Beth talked about today. I think the first step that we all agreed to on the subcommittee was that we would want to make sure that we were determining what the needs were from the public. What are the needs from the farmers? We initially came up with some topics that I'll go through in just a minute, but I think it was important that we go back regularly, annually, and review what the needs are and what the public sees and the farmers see as the true needs for that research. And so the Ag Trade Show was one of the things that came forward as a regular meeting where it was a sort of a perfect venue where that sort of soliciting of feedback could occur. And I think we're going to do a little bit of that today, maybe a little bit modified to what we planned for previously, but you'll have an opportunity then to provide that kind of input. And I think the plan is to do that regularly. So as a group, one of the first things that we discussed were some of the topics, and this is based on sort of the original roadmap that was put forward by DACF, taking a guess at some of the topics and research that would need to be addressed, given the fact that we know relatively little to be able to guide some of the decisions. So these included crops. So there's a lot of work that's been done by DACF, the University of Maine, and others to try to determine which are the crops that take up PFAS. And I'm going to talk broadly about the compounds. Where do they go in the plant itself? How long do they stay there? Are there, for example, crops that can be grown together that will help mitigate the uptake of PFAS? So there are a lot of different questions that need to be answered in crops. And I think there's already been really tremendous progress that's been done in that area. There's definitely a question about soil. So soil is at the core of this whole issue. So how does PFAS move in soils? What are the bioaccumulation factors then? Meaning, how is that PFAS taken up by plants, first of all? And is it accumulated? How does PFAS move in the soil and get into the water? How does the water deliver it to soil? So really, soil is at the core of a lot of the questions that we need answered in order to provide really useful methods to mitigate PFAS. And so that was talked about within our subcommittee quite a bit. And of course, we've talked quite a bit today about livestock. So what are the transfer factors for livestock? And basically what that means is how do PFAS then go into the animal and actually accumulate in the animal products that we use from water, feed, and milk. And so then what are those correlations, just as Duncan talked about today, in blood and in the meat, and all of those elimination kinetics basically related in the animal. Also water, there's a lot of questions related to the increased use of irrigation. And typically then what are those irrigation pathways that PFAS may follow? What are the ways then that irrigation is taken up by the crop and then eventually ends up in animals? It's all this one big cycle. So here's I'm a crop physiologist. So basically sometimes the way you apply water to a crop and when you do it very much changes how it's taken up. So there could be a lot of questions related to irrigation and the pathways associated with it. Other topics, distribution in the milk, use of contaminated biomass for silt barriers. So essentially creating some barriers within the field that may basically stop the passageway of PFAS in soils or in water. How we might be able to sense PFAS, develop sensors in which they could be implanted in the soil and they could basically monitor PFAS and how it changes over time. And ultimately, basically, to be able to deliver decision support tools to farmers. So how do you make those decisions related to selling the crop, planting the crop, harvesting the crop? That's the ultimate goal of all of this research. There are some questions related to methods. So these came up in our subcommittee. So for example, how many soil samples do you need to really be able to characterize what's in the field? How frequently do you need to do those samples? Some of the things that Duncan talked about, how frequently should you be sampling the animals? And so DACF is already working on some of these questions. So I think what we wanted to do today then was to offer an opportunity to solicit some feedback from this group on what other research priorities that the group would envision. Do you want me to just capture these on the, and luckily there's a marker. So I'm happy to take ideas and feedback. Yes, sir.
My biggest concern is because what is the migration of the stuff in the aquifers and how do you track it? And I think that is one of the biggest, should be, I think, one of the biggest issues.
Beth, I don't know if you can capture these so I don't have to spend my time writing. That would be awesome. Great, thank you. Awesome input. Others? Yes, I'm sorry. I think that was the other point that we wanted to make. Prioritize. So of those questions, we know they're really important. What are the ones that are really the first that we should be following? Yes, sir. Oh.
Thanks. I'm going to stop screen sharing so that the folks online can see the people in the room. I will maybe stop screen sharing. No, the second half of our session here is one-on-one conversations with staff. That's not to be recorded, but this is still part of the public meeting. Thank you. Touchpad isn't working. Well, no, I just thought it would be. That's what I'm trying to do, but the touchpad's not working. There we go. Great. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So now people on Zoom can see us. I just want folks on Zoom to be able to see the room. Can they? That's fine. Yeah. Thank you. So the question was, how much is this group working towards source reduction? Not a lot. DEP and the legislature, that is really their primary focus. Our focus within the Department of Agriculture is on supporting the food system. Do you want?
Hi there. Just to add to a little bit more of what's happening elsewhere in the state, there are two statutes, laws in place where by 2030, all products sold in the state of Maine that have intentionally added PFAS as part of their components will no longer be available to be sold. By 2025, all of those products will have to have been reported to DEP. And then by 2030, those products are no longer able to be sold in Maine. There is an exemption process by which DEP will be looking at these products. I don't know how that will be working. That's built into the law. However, this is a pretty sweeping bill in that, or law, I should say, in that it will be directly addressing ideally the reduction of PFAS in Maine's environment because they will no longer be in the products that are being sold and utilized. There's also a PFAS in packaging law that is looking particularly at those products that are used for food containers. That is in the process of being implemented again through DEP. So from a legislative and policy process, there is a lot happening in Maine for source reduction. Hopefully that helps augment a little bit of your question. Did you have any follow-up? No? Okay. Yes, sir.
On my well right now, and it's being checked quarterly. What's the timeline for that? Is that going to continue for a certain time?
Yeah. Is that for DEP?
I assume so, yeah.
Yeah, so we've worked really closely with DEP at farms where the well might also be used for residential purposes. DEP has been filtering wells for contaminants for decades, so it's not a new thing for them to install a treatment system on a well. DEP also has, as part of their, I would say, I guess, normal appropriation, a certain amount of money that goes toward the operation and maintenance of those wells. So that money, it's not something that the state could guarantee in perpetuity, but it's not something that currently, I would say, a homeowner would need to be concerned about paying for the operation or maintenance of that well. Did that answer your question? Right, right. Yeah. Which is the best answer that we can give. I don't work for the DEP, but we do have folks downstairs at our booth that do, and they might be able to give you some more particulars about that program when it comes to residential wells.
Thank you, Duncan. This is the open Q&A and feedback session, but I do want to just reiterate that if there are ideas or suggestions that you all have relative to the research areas to offer them now or in the future, we do have, as Director Beth Valentine mentioned, a very specific focus of the fund that will be underwriting significant research projects. So we want to make sure that our scope and our requests for applications in those research arenas really meet the needs of our agricultural community. So we take very seriously what it is that you folks would like to see prioritized. Absolutely, come on up. We might as well just tag team here, Beth.
I wanted to mention, so we had hoped to do a little exercise today where you could walk up to these posters and put a little sticky note beside those that you felt were highest priority. Given the size constraints in this room, I don't think that's practical. We do have a survey online on DACF's website. Navigate through to the PFAS fund section, and there's a survey with the same research topics. And again, you can go through and rate those as high, medium, or low priority. And there's also a section where you can suggest additional research topics. So please, I invite you to go online, complete that survey. But also, we're here today, we're here to listen, and would love to hear your suggestions.
Not a farmer.
Wait. People online.
Okay, I'm not a farmer. I work for DACF, and I have a question about, I guess, research funding. What comes to mind is the SARE, Sustainable Agricultural Research. I don't know what the E stands for. So farmers can submit proposals. I want to study this, and I guess they often have partners in academia or extension. I'm wondering if that model would work for PFAS impacted farmers. They have a particular thing they want to solve or look into. This.
So I think that's the plan. The subcommittee did talk about giving preference on some proposals, particularly for those with that are co-created and co-developed with farmers. So I think that is, to me, that's essential. I don't know how else to have a good research project in this area. But I don't know, because I'm not on the rule making or what the RFA is going to say. I think that's definitely was the feeling of the subcommittee.
Yeah, the draft rules includes evaluation criteria, and collaboration is definitely one of those evaluation criteria that we will be looking at when we're evaluating proposals.
My situation is probably a little unique. I have a farm I've had for 20 years, actually with a family farm. We're trying to keep it going and trying to keep it in agriculture. It's still active as far as we cut hay and sell wood products and so forth. But we don't really take any income from everything we make goes back into farming, because you can only farm as long as your money lasts. And that's what the model we're following. would I be eligible for any benefits where I don't show income from that property?
Yeah, eligibility is based on commercial farms, but so you're selling product, but it's all that money goes back to pay expenses, right? Right. So generally speaking, yes, like income replacement, you would not be eligible for because I don't think. I mean, we can talk specifics, but generally speaking, yes, any active farm is potentially eligible. Maybe someone.
So we're looking at your intent to sell a product. So basically your gross, not necessarily your net. And yes, it's we recognize that farms operate on very tight margins. So you don't need to show a net profit to be an active commercial farm, as long as you're intending to sell a product of some sort or be utilizing it. And I also just want to take the opportunity to say, if you are someone in that sort of maybe I'm eligible, maybe I'm not. Our team, please reach out to our team. If you have any questions or are wondering what your property looks like for contamination, we are very happy to have one-on-one conversations. Like we've been emphasizing, every farm is unique, and we're more than happy to chat with individuals and work through questions with you on a one-on-one basis. As long as you were selling something, then we would consider you an active farm, and we would be happy to look at exposure routes. The other thing that because it's on topic here, for Maine DEP, they are focusing on historically licensed application sites. Maine DACF recognizes that you might be purchasing hay from another location that might have had contamination. You might have inputs other than the historical land application. We're focusing on those sites because we feel like they are the highest risk and greatest concern, but you don't necessarily need to be on the map to talk to us about your situation. And we might not be able to help or evaluate in all situations, but we can at least have a conversation with you. And we're always very happy to do that.
We sell hay, and we've been selling to people for 20 years or more. We've told them the situation. They said we didn't realize it before and that we were all right. So they continue to buy it. I've had no one refuse to buy the hay because of PFAS.
Yeah, so I'm not that's great news. I'm not sure if if you have any historical applications at your farm or not. So if there was a reason to believe there might be a concern. But like I said, okay, DP came out and tested. So yeah, we should chat more in the one-on-one section of our program here, or morning. But we can chat more.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. I'm going to bring. Well, it's only so the people online can hear you. It doesn't amplify, but otherwise they can't hear the question.
Oh, I got it. I'm basically in the same boat as this guy up front. But, oh, I know you. Looks like you guys have done a pretty good job at it, but in addition to what he's concerned about, my concern is about land values. And I have a son who wanted to take over the farm, but then he's got 2 little kids and he doesn't want them running around in dusty PFAS stuff and drinking PFAS soup. So he bought a farm somewhere else. So I'm just wondering, perhaps this should be not a question I ask here, but I just wanted to raise the subject. Okay.
Thank you. And we can talk more about your particular situation, but generally speaking, for commercial farmers who don't want to stay on the land, the PFAS fund will be able to purchase impacted property at the fair market value as if there was no contamination. We'll be rolling that program out once the rules are finalized. We'll begin accepting inquiries, hopefully in the late February, early March timeframe. And if you want to speak about the specifics of your property, I'm happy to do that.
Just mobilize it. In one of your slides, I got the impression that animals that are grazing on the land aren't as apt to get the PFAS as if they get it from feed. Did I misunderstand that?
So I can speak more to the specifics of that situation. It's not that the grazing was the factor that reduced the PFAS in the animal's body. The biggest contributing factor that we're looking at is the concentration of PFAS in the soil. So for that particular farm, we had really high levels in their hay fields, but we had really low levels in the pastures. And so because of that, we could use the pastures as a mechanism to allow the animals to depurate, because when they're grazing on those pastures, because of the low levels in the soil, they're not going to be exposed to the same degree that they would when they're eating the dry hay from the hay fields. That's correct. And if we were to get into the details, the licensed application sites were the hay fields, but applications were not made to the pastures, and that's a relatively common scenario that we've seen with beef and dairy farms that have had sludge applied.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think it's really an important reminder that farms that did have land application, it's on discrete areas of their land, not wall to wall, four corners. That's why these investigations are very important to pinpoint where there's concern versus where there's not. We are coming kind of close to the time of this wrap up, but I do want to invite further reflection on the fund. Director Valentine gave a great overview of all the areas that are being focused on and being developed and are in process. If there are gaps, greater needs, strong opinions on that, we welcome them now or in the future. This is an evolving program and project, and we want to be of service to the best of our ability. Mike.
I'm wondering about the timeline of the fund, the amount of money that you have, how long will it last? Are there other sources of income down the road?
Yeah, so we have $60 million in hand from the state, an additional $5 million from USDA. Our projected budget in the plan is $70 million. So that's 5 million shy, do the math. We will continue to look for additional sources of funding, particularly federal sources. And also what we have in the plan is a projected budget. Once we move into the implementation phase, we're going to have a better sense of how many people are taking advantage of each of the different programs. So at this point, we're thinking the fund will last about 5 years. And, we'll be monitoring as we go. There will, we are required to report to the legislature annually. So by March 1 of every year, there's going to be, a sort of a check-in of where we are, what remains to be done, what our budgetary needs are. So at a minimum, that report will be available, but we'll continue to have meetings like this and reach out through different avenues to keep the public informed about how the money is being spent.
I wanted to go back a bit to the research priorities, and I'm not sure if it's something that the research committee has discussed yet. But I would like to note for the record that I think it would be a good idea to put on that list research regarding mass loading for impacted PFAS products, including cut hay from fields with high levels of PFAS, as well as compost from impacted sources, and what effect that, as well as and manure from animals that might be affected, and what impact that could have on fields that were not historically spread or on other areas. I think it's not an area of research that I've heard the fund discuss, but I think it's one that's worth looking into.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, I don't remember catching your name, but I guess just one thing I wanted to, that I was hearing from what you were saying, that I hope just in general people understand is like who qualifies for this fund, and just like reiterating that it's, if you are like the intent to sell, or like if you are selling a commercial product, it's not, you don't have, most farms like don't really have much for profit, right? And so it's not about how much you're profiting. Does it relate to like if you qualify for support, if you've had spreading on your land, or if you've impacted soils or water. And I hope that gets out to the general farm community more than anything, just so know that if you do qualify or not for support.
Yes, thank you. As Megan said, if you have a question about if you're eligible, if you want testing, reach out to Megan or myself, and we'll have those conversations with you. And speaking of conversations, the next half of our time in this room, so from now until 1 p.m., staff from both the PFAS response team and the PFAS fund will be here ready to talk to you about any questions that you might not want to discuss in a larger group setting. Also, Rick Kersberg, dairy specialist in the back. Once the formal meeting concludes, we can have more of those one-on-one conversations. Oh, thank you. Could people online hear that? Oh, okay. All right. So there was a question about whether people who are involved in the lawsuit against the PFAS manufacturers are ineligible for support from the PFAS fund. No, we do not consider status as a plaintiff or not in any of our considerations for eligibility. Any further questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And like I said, staff will be hanging out in this room for a bit to answer any individual questions that folks may have. Thank you.